sections of the Fashion Institute of Technology, and particularly for the oral history of the school itself, this will be an interview with Norman Goodman, son of one of the original founders, A. Goodman. The date is February 8th, 1985. The interviewer is Mildred Finger. Norman, before we talk about your father's involvement in FIT and your own involvement in FIT, would you tell us about tell us something of his story, where he was born and when and how he got into this business, and just as much as you can remember.
Well, my dad was born in Romania in 1898. And he came to the States at age 9 with his father and I believe an older sister. And in the course of the next year or two, his mother and the rest of the family came over. My dad started to work in the garment industry when he was about 11 or 12 years old.
That means he worked all the way on the Lower East Side.
Yes,
right?
oh yes, they lived on the Lower East Side, and the factories were down there, and he began as an errand boy, I believe age 11, and by the time my dad was 14 or 15, he was an experienced cutter. I can remember stories that he told when he was about 12 or 13, being taken out to lunch and watching the cutters take home a $10 bill. And he said, gee, would I ever live to see the day that I could earn that kind of money? And
how did he learn how to be a cutter?
He said he just watched. He was working, I guess, 15, 18-hour days, and he would work and then stay and watch and observe the different trades, and he had a knack for cutting, and he worked at it, and he became a cutter, I think 15 or 16 years of age. He was a skilled cutter, which meant in those days spreading the fabric and understanding the patterns. My dad then had a responsibility with his family, and I believe he went into business for the first time when he was 19 or 20 years old, and then he went on, he formed a partnership with someone else, and Goodman and Davidson, I believe the company was called, in the early 20s, and built up a rather large business.
Was that still on the Lower East Side, or had they moved?
No, I'm sorry, the garment industry moved up, I believe, to the 20s, the West 20s. I remember my dad telling stories about how the industry would move and how he would move his place because that was the building to be in. And then from the 20s, he formed A. Goodman and Company in 1932, thereabout, and which was his sole business. He was in no partners, and I believe they opened in 525 7th Avenue. They had moved from 1410 Broadway or something. 525 was the building for his price dresses. Everybody sort of moved together. The showrooms were, at that time, 525 was the building for his price range. And his type
It
of
subsequently
product.
became 530,
Yes,
right?
then in
Later years, yeah.
1936 or 37, I believe, he moved to 537th Avenue, which was the building he stayed in until
Right.
he went into business in 60. My dad became very active in the years in the industry itself. He became very close with a lot of the union leaders, David Chaplinsky, and they made my dad the sole countersignature for their health fund.
Really?
They wanted one manufacturer to represent them on the fund, and he was the signatory of that. And my dad was active in charities, especially the Home and Hospital of the Daughters of Israel. He was a chief fundraiser and treasurer for them. And this was, I would say, right into the start of the World War II. He was on the War Production Board.
Just 1 second. In those days, where did his labor come from? How was it trained?
Well, at that time, all the labor in the industry was basically foreign-born. I can recall the sewing machine operators, for instance, were mostly men, and foreign-born men who learned their trade in Russia or Eastern Europe. There were very few American-born labor involved in the sewing operation, the cutting operation, finishing. The finishes, I think at the time, I remember hand sewers, finishes, were West Indian.
Were they really?
Yes.
Yes.
Quite a predominance of West Indian. But the sewing machine, the highly skilled operators, were Eastern Europeans and Russians. I would say mainly ethnic groups, Jewish and Italian. And oddly enough, very few women. Out of the 60 machines in my dad's plant at the time, I think there were
Was his
50.
plant in 530?
His plant, he was one of the few manufacturers who did not subcontract all of their manufacturing. He had his own in-house plant. My dad liked to do his own cutting and control a portion of his own sewing operation. And out of the 60 machines, I remember there were 54 men and 6 women. And again, none of them American-born.
And of course the pressers were men, and they were
All the presses were
Europeans
from
as
Eastern
well.
Europe,
Right,
Europeans, and again, no, at that time I don't think there were any. I saw a sprinkling of American-born skilled workers in the cutting operation, but none of them on a sewing machine as such, on a skilled operation.
What about designers? Did you work with a designer at
Oh,
that
yes.
time?
Oh,
You
yes. Yeah. Designers were, the designers at the time, I think Julia Richards, he had for several years, American-born. She used to make trips, I mean, even then in the 30s, to Paris twice a year. Inspiration, mainly, I remember talking about that. And
But up to that point, there really was no school for designers.
no school for designers, and there were no very few, I should say, named designers.
Yes,
I can remember
right.
in later years, Norman Norell.
Yeah,
and,
right. Well, in those days, it was the manufacturer's name.
It was the
which there.
manufacturer's name. It was Maurice Renton. I remember when Bill Blass started there, but it was Maurice Renton.
Right,
That was the
sure.
name, the label name.
Right. So, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but you were saying that your father had, he, at the time of the war, you had just mentioned the words War
Yeah.
Production Board.
Yeah, he became very active on the War Production Board for the industry and would go to Washington, I think once a month at the time. I remember he and several other manufacturers at the time. There was a restriction such as, I think it was named L85, where they were limited to 3.5 yards per garment and other things. And at that time, I believe he became active also in the founding, this was the 40s, in the founding of the Educational Foundation for the Apparel Industry.
Right.
I believe that was what the organization had started, thinking in terms of a school. And my first exposure to it was when I was discharged from the service in May of '46. And my dad said, well, what are we going to do now, you know? And I said, well, I'm thinking of going back to school, college. And he said, well, have you thought about the business? And I said, yes, I'm thinking about that. And he said, well, I'd like you to come down and meet Dr. Mortimer Ritter. We started a new school for the industry, and I'd like to, I'd like to have you meet him and hear what he has to say about school, etc.
Now, did your father at that time tell you anything about how the school had come into being? I mean, had he discussed any of his and his friends' interests, or was that something that was not said or talked about?
The only recollection I have is that he said that he was helping to support a school for the industry, and he wanted Dr. Ritter to explain to me what it was all about. And at the time, I didn't even think about attending the school. It was just I was going down to meet Mortimer Ritter, who would talk to me about this particular school and about my going into the industry. And I remember going down to 24th Street, 7th Ave, off 7th Avenue, to
Which
the
is the
Central High School of Needle
Trades.
Trades. I think that was the
Yeah,
name then.
right.
And going up to the 8th floor and meeting Dr. Ritter, who was the, I guess he was the guiding force at the time. And he spoke to me, and I told him I had just gotten out of the service, and I was looking forward to going back to school, ultimately to go into my dad's business. And he took me around, and after spending about an hour with him, I decided that I would attend the management course at FIT. I had enough of being away from home for 2.5 years. I liked the idea of being in the city, and the course, as he outlined it, seemed to fit in.
What did he
with
tell
my
you about
future
the
plans.
courses?
Well, he explained to me that the school was 2 years old, and that in addition to the design school, which predominantly FIT was, they had a management course, a scientific management course, which dealt with production and business management as it relates specifically to the apparel industry. And that I would learn whether it be time and motion study of a sewing machine operator or cutting operation as it applied to my industry. So if I went to another school where I might be involved in heavy industry or something that I would never relate to if I were going into the apparel industry, I thought, gee, it makes sense. And I decided I would start, I think it was in September of '46, which was then the beginning, I believe, of the third year. I think the
Right,
first
right.
graduating class had just graduated
Right,
in
exactly.
June of '48.
Right. And they, the first graduating class, no, I think was in June of '46, wasn't it?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, June
I'm
of
sorry,
46.
June of '46.
And
Right,
because you
this
were
was in, yeah.
September
Yeah, right.
'46, right.
The school had started in '44, right? I was...
Yes, it had,
Now-
because they've just celebrated the 40th anniversary this past year.
Right. And my dad, I think at the time, although he was, I remember he was friendly with Morris Taft and several other members. And I believe at the time he was supporting it by giving a scholarship so that a student could attend FIT.
Was there a fee at that time for the,
You know, I went to school under the Veterans Administration, and the tuition, there was no tuition that I can recall, but there were other costs involved.
Yes,
And
of
whatever
course.
it was, I think it was a nominal $400, $800 a year. That would buy a scholarship for a
Right.
student.
right,
And I believe that out of the total class, at the time, the management class that I think we had about no more than 20 students.
of whom
in
how many were
management.
male and how many female?
All male at the time.
Really?
Management, all male. The design, fashion design and millinery design was predominantly, the rest of the school was 95% female.
They know, that sounds about right, because
Yeah.
I've heard comparable figures, yeah. And so you spent how many years was it?
I
2
spent
years?
2 years,
2
yes.
years,
I
right.
graduated in June of '48. I
Mhm.
started in September of '46.
Yeah. And then during the time that you came to school here, were you working for your father as well, or was this
No, I went to
totally-
school, the first year, basically I was in school full-time. I would go up to my dad's office in the late afternoons, but I wasn't really active until my senior year. We had a program whereby you would have field work, and I worked in his factory, as a matter of fact, getting hands-on experience
Yes,
and dealing
right.
with that operation. And
What were your instructors like during those 2 years? Do you remember them at all, or who they were?
yes, I remember Dr. Nathan Brown, who was a sociology.
Right, who subsequently went on to found Shankar in Israel, right?
Right. And
He
yeah,
taught
and he was-
sociology, I didn't know that.
he was a sociology teacher.
So you did have some liberal arts courses?
Oh, yes, yes, we had liberal arts courses. And the school was, at that time, it was still learning its way on which courses would apply to the management. We even learned courses such as draping. You know, we had a sprinkling of the fashion courses that...
Of the design courses
design
as well,
courses.
yes.
Now, I'm just trying to get...
And
Okay, I can remember there was a trade show. There was a man named Arthur Tarshis.
Tarsius.
T-A-R-S-H, Tarshis, T-A-R-C-H-S-H, who was active in putting together trade shows for the textile industry, and then he started one for the fashion industry. And this was in, I guess, 46, in the fall of 46, when I first started at FIT. They had a show which was put together at Grand Central Palace. If you recall, that was the predecessor of the Coliseum. That was where New York had trade shows and or mini conventions and things like that. And FIT was asked to participate. I believe it was in the spring of 47, because I was
First
at
time
school
I've heard
for a
that
while.
story.
Yeah, it was the first show. He was the man who put together these sort of shows for different industries. And I remember FIT was asked to participate, and we were putting together a display of the school and what the school was all about and what the school did. And we had models. The management department had a model layout of a plant showing the process of cutting and manufacturing, sewing machine layout of a particular product. We would show the product and how it was designed and how the plant was laid out, and the fashion areas would show how the students were learning the design areas. And it was a 1 week.
Fascinating.
Yes.
I've never heard that.
Yes. I don't know what happened to that trade show. I don't know how it evolved or what, but I remember that particular one when the school was really just
And the
starting.
students worked on it.
Yes, all the students worked on this project.
Right?
And I remember tours coming through the school in those years. My dad would be down with men, and they would take various political people through. They were always looking for support for the school.
And when you finished school, after your 2 years, you then went to work for your father,
Yes.
right? And tell us about that. I mean, what was it like to be the son of a manufacturer who'd had a little bit of training, and what were your relationships with people there? And how did you apply your skills now?
Well, it made things certainly much easier for me, and I think that the people in my dad's plant at the time loved the idea that I was familiar with a lot of the operations. I actually learned how to sew on a sewing machine. I could sit down and thread a bobbin, things like that, and there were not, at that time, many people in management who had had the kind of training I'd had, and were coming in.
I'm sure they weren't.
You
No,
know,
right.
as the owners of the business and understanding. And
Most owners had probably come up through the ranks themselves and had learned that way
Yes.
without learning any other managerial skills.
Right.
And you stayed there for how many years?
I was there for 10 years.
For 10 years, and you went through the whole, I assume the whole, you went through production and sales and...
Production and then sales, and yes, working with designers and administrating the business. And, yeah.
Did you maintain any contact with FIT during that period?
Yes, after I graduated, I was sort of active in the Alumni Association in the early years. As a matter of fact, several of our designers were products of the Fashion Institute of Technology, and a couple of them were at school when I attended school. They had gone into other companies and.
Can you remember the names of anybody except?
Yes,
like that
I
anyway.
remember in the late 50s, Pat Sandler.
Oh, sure.
I can remember, I can't the names right now, but there were 3 or 4 who I
But there was
remember
nobody in
school.
your class. 'cause
Not in
Al-
my, not
Pat was
in-
much later.
no,
yeah.
no, they were a little later, but
Mhm.
I had gotten to know them because I
Yes.
visited the school, I spoke to certain management classes about my job in the industry, how when I had gotten out of school, what I had specifically learned that I applied in my business. See, a lot of the management graduates went to specific areas of the business, mostly into production. They were production managers. When they got out of school, they were hired by companies to work in their plants.
Yes,
Because
I'm
they
sure those
understood-
skills were not
right,
very.
They understood time and motion study, and they
Yes,
understood work flow, and that's where they wound up. Very few of them had the opportunity that I had going into my father's business, where I had the overall.
In other words, there were not many second-generation people in your classes. I'm interested in
In
knowing
my
about.
class, I was the only
You were the only one.
whose father was, in the business.
Do you know of any others who went into business, whose fathers were in the business? I mean, who
Yes.
went to school?
Yeah, I don't recall their names, but there were a couple of,
Yes, I've never met one. I mean, I've never met one that I've interviewed.
There were a couple of large companies. They weren't New York firms. They were
Uh-huh.
popular price companies. One in St. Louis
I see.
that a big suit operation.
In other words, you did have people from out of town already.
yes.
Very
Yes.
early, in the early days.
Yes, it was not that many, but that was after, about 3 or 4 years after I graduated. And I was going back to the school, and I remember speaking at a class, and there were several students there from the Midwest, Baltimore, whose fathers were in the business, and they were there to
To learn
yes.
about techniques, right? Norman, what happened with your father's business as the years went on? Because ultimately he went out of business,
Yes.
and you went out. You left it.
Well, I started to get involved in real estate investing, and I had a younger brother in the business at the time who was working in the business, but not too happy with
What
it.
was his name?
Robert Good. He had gone to Ohio State and basically had studied liberal arts, and he was not that happy.
Mm-hmm.
And
With
my-
with your father's business.
right,
Yeah. Mhm.
And my dad, we talked about it, and my dad decided if we really didn't want to go on with the business, that he would think in terms of retiring. And after the summer season, after the resort spring line of, which was the fall of 1959, we sort of thought in terms of liquidating the business in early 1960.
And that's when you entered
That's
your real
when-
estate
Yes.
business full time.
Yes, I had a brother-in-law at the time and an associate, and
Mhm.
we were starting a company to invest in managing real estate.
So you weren't builders. You were essentially.
Well,
managers.
we were also building.
You were.
Yeah, we had partners who were builders.
Uh-huh. In what part of New York?
Well, we started in the city itself, building apartment houses.
Oh, I see. Not in commercial.
No, not at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And that was actually I started in '55,
Mm-hmm.
but I was just an investor at
Yes,
the time.
because I have talked to Sidney Bernstein, of course, who's involved heavily in this area.
Oh, yes, I know you.
Yeah,
that's,
and so I wondered if you were at all involved
No,
in.
no, they're
running-
mostly commercial on the west side.
Mhm, right.
No. And my brother went to school, and he went into the insurance business,
Mhm.
which he's still in today. And my dad, of course, after 6 months out of business, had a lot of, he missed it. It was a part of his life.
Yes.
After
Oh,
all, he
yes.
grew up in it, and that's all he ever did And from the time he went out, he just couldn't adjust to the fact of retirement. So Molly Parnas needed somebody to sort of run her shop for her. She, I think Adolph Klein, if you remember that
Mhm.
name.
I remember Adolf very well.
Okay, when Molly's, you know, it's interesting because my dad sort of got, I think before Molly married
Before she married Leon Livingston?
Lonnie Levinson,
Lonnie Levinson?
got them together, yeah. They had the floor right above us at 537th Avenue. A. Goodman and Company was on the 17th floor, Molly Parnas on the 18th floor. All through the 30s into the 40s, 50s. Molly called our former sales manager, and she wanted to speak to me. And I met with Molly, and she thought maybe I was interested in coming back and having something to do. And I said, no, I'm not really the one you want, but my dad is just very anxious to do something. And we got together, we had dinner at Molly's apartment, and she desperately needed somebody to watch the business, the back. She was a great salesperson, and she just needed someone to pick the pieces up from that point. And my
Which
dad
was
was just
very important
ideal,
pieces,
right?
yes.
And he just fit in with that, and he started with Molly, I believe, in 1960.
Mhm. That sounds right.
Yeah.
And then, so he worked in
He
business
worked as,
until...
yeah, were there for about 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
And my dad, yeah, he was in his late 60s then.
No, in his late 60s?
In his late, well, he was about...
Wasn't he older than that?
No. Well, he was born in 1898.
Yes.
So he was in his
Right.
late 60s,
Yeah,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Right.
Dad passed away, it'll be 3 years this January.
Right. And so it's really very interesting that you did make use of your
Oh, yes.
training for a considerable period of time, and then did what a lot of people in the garment industry have done, which is to go into real estate. Yes,
Right.
I thank you very much. This has been really interesting
Well, I
and a
hope I-
different perspective from some others I've had. Thank you.